Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. For months, Americans have been told that the war with Iran is about one thing above all else: preventing Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon. That was the central justification for the war. But now, several months into the conflict, something very strange is happening. The Trump administration is suddenly talking a lot about oil prices, not simply as an economic consequence of the war, but as a major objective of the war itself. Vice President J.D. Vance recently described keeping energy prices low for Americans as the administration's #1 priority, while preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon was presented as the second major objective. And that raises a very uncomfortable question. If keeping oil prices low is now the #1 goal of the war, why wasn't it the goal when the war started? Before February 28, the Strait of Hormuz was open. Oil was moving through it. Global energy markets were functioning, and American gasoline prices were not the central problem Washington was trying to solve through military action against Iran. Then the war began. Iran responded. The Strait of Hormuz became heavily restricted. Oil markets were disrupted. Gasoline prices rose. And now, months later, Washington is saying that reopening the strait and bringing energy prices back down are among its most important priorities. That creates a very strange strategic circle. The United States went to war to eliminate a threat from Iran. The war then created a new crisis around the Strait of Hormuz. And now Washington has to spend enormous political and military resources trying to resolve that crisis. So perhaps the most important question isn't simply whether Trump's war aims have changed. It is this: did the war solve a problem for the United States, or did it create a new problem that Washington now has to solve? That is what makes this moment so important. Because the real story may be less about changing war aims and more about changing definitions of victory. When this war began, the logic was relatively straightforward. The United States and Israel believed Iran was moving dangerously close to obtaining a nuclear weapon. That was considered an unacceptable threat. So, military force was used to destroy or severely damage Iran's nuclear and military capabilities. And early in the war, the Trump administration appeared to have much broader ambitions. There was discussion of Iran's leadership and even the possibility of regime change. But eventually, Washington moved away from openly presenting regime change as the objective. The focus returned to Iran's nuclear program. Now we have another development. Energy prices and the Strait of Hormuz have become central to the discussion. And this is where the story gets much more interesting. Because before the war, the United States did not have to fight a war to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. It was already open. Oil was already moving. The problem Washington is now trying to solve did not exist in its current form before the war. It emerged as a consequence of the war. That doesn't automatically mean the war was a mistake. Iran's nuclear program may have been significantly damaged. Its military capabilities may have been degraded. Its leadership may have suffered enormous losses. Those are real military outcomes. But military outcomes are not the same thing as strategic outcomes. And that distinction becomes extremely important once a war lasts for months. Because winning battles is about destroying the enemy's capabilities. Winning a war is about creating a political situation that is better for you when the fighting stops. Those are not always the same thing. And right now, Iran appears to be betting heavily on that difference. This may be the most important part of the story. Iran does not necessarily need to defeat the United States militarily. It may simply need to avoid collapsing. That is a very different objective. For Washington, time can be expensive. For Tehran, time can be a weapon. Think about the imbalance. The United States has vastly greater military power. It has a powerful navy. It has advanced aircraft. It has precision weapons. It has enormous economic resources. But the United States also has a political system with elections, public opinion, financial markets, and an economy that responds to energy prices. Iran has much fewer advantages. But it has one potentially powerful advantage. It can play for time, and Iranian officials appear to understand this. Iran has increasingly treated the Strait of Hormuz not simply as a military position, but as a bargaining chip. The message from Tehran is essentially, if Washington wants the strait fully reopened, Washington must make concessions. That turns Hormuz into leverage. and it changes the nature of the conflict. The United States can blockade Iranian ports. Iran can threaten shipping. Washington can impose sanctions. Tehran can try to make those sanctions more expensive for the United States and the global economy. Washington can threaten more military action. Iran can threaten to keep the conflict going. This is no longer simply a contest over who can destroy more military targets. It becomes a contest over who can tolerate pressure longer. And that is exactly where Iran may believe it has an opportunity. Recent statements from Iranian officials and advisors have openly suggested that Tehran could seek to prolong the conflict and wait out political pressure in Washington. One senior advisor to Iran's Revolutionary Guard even suggested that Iran could continue the confrontation until Trump leaves office if necessary. That is an extraordinary statement, but strategically it makes sense. Iran doesn't have to convince America that Iran is stronger. It only has to convince America that continuing the war is too expensive. And that is a much lower bar. This is why the oil issue matters, but not because gasoline prices alone determine American elections. The deeper issue is that oil prices are one visible measure of the cost of the war. If the war produces higher gasoline prices, higher transportation costs, more inflationary pressure, and greater uncertainty, then the political cost of continuing the war increases. And the closer America gets to the midterms, the more important that political cost becomes. So, Iran doesn't necessarily have to defeat Trump at the ballot box. It simply needs the American political system to become less willing to keep paying the price of the war. That is what I mean by a time strategy. Iran may be trying to create a situation in which every additional month produces a different kind of pressure on Washington. Military pressure, economic pressure, political pressure, diplomatic pressure, and, eventually, pressure from America's allies. That strategy has risks, of course. Iran is suffering enormous economic damage. Its oil exports have been severely constrained. Inflation is extremely high. The country is under military pressure, and its population is paying a heavy price. So Iran is not sitting comfortably and simply waiting for America to collapse. Far from it. The Iranian leadership is making a gamble. It is betting that it can survive the pain longer than Washington can maintain the political consensus necessary to continue the war. That is a very different calculation from trying to win a conventional military confrontation, and it may explain why Tehran has been so unwilling to simply reopen the Strait of Hormuz. From Washington's perspective, reopening the strait is an urgent objective because it would reduce pressure on energy markets. From Tehran's perspective, reopening the strait without getting something in return would mean giving up one of its strongest remaining bargaining chips. So Iran has an incentive to keep the strait closed or heavily restricted until it believes it can extract concessions. And that brings us back to the central irony of this war. Before February 28, the strait was functioning. After the war began, it became a weapon. Now Washington wants to restore the situation that existed before the war. But Tehran is essentially saying, you don't get to go back to February 27 for free. That is a very important strategic point. The starting position has changed, and once the starting position changes, ending a war becomes much harder. This is also why Trump's recent shift toward economic pressure is significant. After military operations, threats, and diplomatic efforts failed to produce a quick settlement, the administration has increasingly turned back toward sanctions and economic pressure to force Iran to negotiate over its nuclear program and reopen Hormuz. That tells us something. Washington still believes economic pressure can break Iran's resistance. Tehran believes the opposite. Iran believes that if it can absorb enough economic pain, the United States will eventually decide that the cost of continuing is too high. So both sides are now betting on endurance. America is betting that Iran's economy will break first. Iran is betting that America's political patience will break first. That may be the real contest taking place right now. And this is where the phrase, military victory does not equal strategic victory becomes important. Imagine that the United States has successfully destroyed large parts of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. That could be a major military achievement. But what happens next? Does Iran permanently abandon its nuclear ambitions? Does the Iranian government accept a new political settlement? Does the Strait of Hormuz reopen? Do sanctions disappear? Does Iran accept America's regional security demands? Or does Tehran simply rebuild, adapt, and wait for another opportunity? Those are strategic questions. Destroying military targets can change the balance of power, but it doesn't automatically determine what happens afterward. And Iran's current strategy appears designed precisely around that gap between military destruction and political outcomes. Iran can lose weapons and still preserve the regime. It can lose infrastructure and still preserve its political system. It can suffer enormous economic damage and still refuse to surrender. And as long as the leadership believes that time is working against Washington, it has an incentive to keep negotiating slowly, demanding more, and avoiding a final settlement. That is why the timing of negotiations matters so much. If Iran negotiates too quickly, it may give up its leverage. If it waits too long, however, the economic pressure could become unbearable. So Tehran is trying to find the point at which its leverage is greatest. And Washington is trying to find the point at which Iran's pain becomes greater than its willingness to resist. This is essentially a game of chicken. Both sides believe the other side will eventually blink. The United States believes Iran's economy cannot survive indefinitely. Iran believes America's political system cannot tolerate indefinite war indefinitely. And the Strait of Hormuz sits in the middle of this confrontation. It is not just an oil route. It is a bargaining chip. It is an economic weapon. And increasingly, it is a symbol of who controls the terms of the endgame. That is why Trump's recent comments about potentially maintaining American control over the strait are so significant. Washington is no longer simply saying, "We need Hormuz reopened." It is talking about who gets to control the strategic waterway after the war. Iran, unsurprisingly, rejects that completely. So the disagreement isn't only about whether ships can pass. It is about who gets to write the rules after the fighting stops. And that brings us back to the question we started with. If Hormuz was open before the war, why is reopening it now one of the central objectives? The answer may be that the war has entered a second phase. The first phase was about destroying Iranian capabilities. The second phase is about forcing Iran to accept a political settlement. And that second phase may be much harder than the first. Because Iran doesn't have to win a battlefield victory. It only needs to survive long enough to improve its bargaining position. That is why time may be Tehran's most important weapon. And it is also why Washington's domestic politics matter so much. Not because American voters will decide the war based on the price of a tank of gas alone, but because every additional cost reduces the room the president has to maneuver. A war that is popular for 3 months can become unpopular after 6 months. A temporary gasoline spike can become a political problem if it persists. A military campaign that looks decisive on television can look very different when Americans start asking, how much longer? How much is this costing? What exactly are we trying to accomplish? And most importantly, when does this end? Those questions are becoming harder for the Trump administration to avoid. And this is why I would be careful about saying that Trump has simply changed his war aims. That is probably too simplistic. The administration still says preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon is a core objective. What has changed is the environment in which that objective has to be achieved. The war has created new problems. Hormuz is now a problem. Energy prices are now a problem. The duration of the conflict is now a problem. And Iran's willingness to wait is now a problem. So perhaps the real transformation is not in the official war aims. It is in the definition of what Washington considers an acceptable ending. At the beginning, the question was, can America stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon? Now the question is becoming, can America achieve that objective, reopen Hormuz, reduce the economic damage, preserve political support at home, and still walk away claiming a victory? That is a much harder challenge, and Iran knows it. Tehran's strategy appears to be built around exactly this contradiction. The United States has greater military power. Iran has fewer resources. But Iran doesn't need to match America's strength. It needs to make America's strength expensive. That is the essence of a strategy based on time. And if Iran can continue doing that, the war may gradually shift from a contest over missiles and aircraft into a contest over political endurance. That is the point Americans should be watching now. Not simply how many Iranian targets are destroyed, not simply whether another round of sanctions is announced. And not even simply whether oil prices go up or down tomorrow. The bigger question is, who benefits from another month of war? If another month gives Washington more leverage because Iran's economy is collapsing, then time favors America. But if another month gives Tehran more leverage because American political pressure, energy costs, and war fatigue continue to grow, then time favors Iran. And that is the strategic gamble now underway. The United States entered this war with overwhelming military superiority. But military superiority does not guarantee political control of the endgame. Iran may not be able to defeat America militarily, but it may be able to make victory so expensive, complicated, and politically difficult that Washington eventually has to accept a settlement that looks very different from the one it wanted at the beginning. That is the real question behind the latest debate over Trump's war aims. Did Trump change the goal? Maybe. But perhaps the more important thing is that the war itself changed the goal. Before the war, America wanted to change Iran. Now America also has to deal with what the war changed in the region, in energy markets, and at home. And if Washington ultimately ends the conflict by negotiating over the very strait that was open before the war, while trying to bring gasoline prices back down and prevent Iran from rebuilding its nuclear capabilities, then Americans will have to make a much broader judgment. Not simply, did America win the war? But, did America end up better off than it was before the war began? Because that is the real test of strategy. A battlefield victory can destroy an enemy's weapons. A strategic victory has to produce a better political reality. And right now, that outcome is still very much undecided. Thanks for watching.